Okay, beautiful. All right. Thanks all for joining me. And we're going to begin from Shabbos' Chumash and then take it from there. We're recapping exactly how the Jews built all the items in the temple. So we posted pictures in the original class when Hashem commanded Moshe to build it in Parshas Teruma and Tetzava. We have all the pictures over there, but today is just more or less a repeat about the stuff in the Mishkan that took place, how they actually built it. So let's learn it inside. Verse 1. And they built the altar of the burnt offering. So there's two kinds of altars. There's the altar of the spices offerings and also the burnt animal offerings. So we're talking about the altar that's being used for the burnt animal offerings. They made the altar atishitim. They made it out of wood, out of pine wood. It was like a large stage. It was 5 cubits was its width. And 5 cubits was its length. So it was like 7.5 feet, about 7.5 feet by 7.5 feet. Nice big stage. Ravua should be squared. And the stage was 3 amas high, was 3 cubits high. So that's about, 5 feet high. So again, a nice high and a decent size squared stage. But Yas Karnoisov, and as the altar, both altars had horns, they had corners coming out on the 4 edges of them. Al Arba Pinoisov on the 4 corners. The Menu Hoyu, and it should come out from it, should be one piece of wood coming out from the pine wood that the base is made out of. So the stage should have 4 corners. And you should overlay it and you should paint it with copper. So you didn't see wood when you looked at it, you saw copper. But the copper was sitting on wood, on a wood frame. Yas is called klei hamizbeach, and then also you should make they made all the vessels that were necessary connected to the altar. Which means they had different items necessary for the altar. They had pots, and they had shovels, and they had a sprinkling basin, all different things that were needed for the meat. Flesh hook to flip over the meat so that it burns well on the altar, and the fire pans that they would carry maybe some of the fire to move from one place to the next. And all its things were made called Kelav Asan Achayshas, verse 3, all its items were made out of copper. Everything that was related to the outer altar was made out of copper. Now on that copper altar, they had a design. Yas, the mizbeach around the border, the middle of the altar, they make michbar maisei reshes nechoishes. They make a copper grating of network. Okay, so it had like a fancy design, like a copper grating, like a network. I think we learned then that would catch the meat, maybe that was like falling on the floor. It would catch it in that copper grating. I believe we learned that somewhere. Tachas karkuvoi, you make it beneath its ledge, lamata ad chetziyoi, from below until its middle. So basically, if I remember correctly, there's going to be some blood that when they sprinkle it, some blood has to go on the top part of the altar and some blood has to go on the bottom part of the altar. And they had a kind of a border that would tell you which is the top part, like kind of split the top and the bottom. And somewhere over there in the middle, near that border, there was also this mesh work, this netting work, this copper design that went around the copper side of the altar. Verse 5, and then they should cast 4 rings. On the 4 corners, the 4 edges, by the copper grating, they would stick 4 copper rings at the sides of the altar. But they were houses for the poles that would carry them, because they would carry this big stage in the desert. We'll see in a minute a little bit more about this stage. And they would then build the poles, which were made out of the same pine wood. And they covered it up with copper. So everything was covered with copper relating to this altar. And they would stick the poles, the carrying poles, inside the rings, at the edges of the altar, to carry them. Now, just one interesting fact about the altar: it was hollowed out of board. So meaning the altar wasn't a solid stage that had filled in the middle, like many stages. If people want to build a stage, they just build the outer shell of the stage. Okay, so they built the outer shell out of pine wood of the stage with copper covering, with copper casing, and then they would carry it. Imagine if it was full in the middle of the altar the whole time. How would you carry such a heavy thing? So it was a large stage that people would carry this big stage that was 7.5 feet by 7.5 feet square by like 5 feet tall, with a copper plating and pine wood wood on the inside, creating the stage. That is how it worked. And then I believe the last item of furniture that we're going to talk about is a very interesting Rashi here. They made the kiyar, they made the wash basin. Also, that was made out of the same material, the nechoshas, the copper, Raskani nechoshas, and the base of it was made out of copper. However, he's going to tell you it's very famous Rashi here, which we mentioned when we learned this originally in Parshas Kisisa, when we spoke about the original Hashem commanding him. Here it comes. We spoke about a famous story which Rashi talks about, and I'll read it inside. They made it out of marois hatzoivos, the mirrors of the women who set up legions, meaning they set up like an army. They set up legions, meaning like an army. They set up Am Yisrael. That they brought it and they congregated as a group. They congregated as like an army. They came as a whole group to the tent of meeting. The women came together to make these donations, and they brought their mirrors that were used to set up the army, the legions, the army of the Jewish people. So Rashi says, what's the story here, famous story here with these mirrors? I'll read you what Rashi says. Rashi says that these women had these mirrors, maybe even like handheld mirrors or something that they would use. What were they used to? They were used to beautify themselves, to dress up and adorn themselves. And they brought these mirrors that they used to make themselves look pretty and nice. Even those things, they wanted to give everything to the donate in the temple. So they brought the mirrors too. And Moshe Rabbeinu was disgusted by them. He said, mirrors, these things are used for the Yetzer Hara, for the evil inclination, to make people sin, to dress up immodestly and so on. So Hashem told Moshe Rabbeinu, who was going to refuse them, he says, no, take them. These are more important to me than all of them. Because of these mirrors, the women set up the Am Yisrael, the nation, the army of the Jewish people who are going to leave Mitzrayim. When their husbands would come home, Rashi says, all tired and worn, Pharaoh would make them work till the last energy, to sap the energy from these men. And they would come home from a full day of work like that. The women would go and bring food and drink and bring their mirrors, and they would look in the mirrors together with their husbands. The women would be with their husbands and look in the mirrors, and they would entice them, create their desires. They would say to their husbands, I'm more beautiful than you. And the husbands came home, they were zonked, they were tired from the whole day's work. And they would end up getting their husbands awake and having children together with their husbands. There, like I think it says even in the field, like they would entice and lure their husbands. And this, Hashem says, wasn't a bad thing. That was a beautiful thing. That was an amazing thing. And that created the Am Yisrael through the women's acts. That created the future Jewish people who are going to leave Mitzrayim. And the copper wash basin will be made from these mirrors that the women use to set up Am Yisrael. Rashi says, well, why? That's very beautiful. That's very amazing. That's very interesting, Hashem's perspective on these mirrors. But why is it that specifically the copper wash basin, out of all the items in the temple, were created from the woman's mirrors? Why that of everything else? So Rashi says a very interesting answer. He says, we're going to learn, as we learned in our Gemara class on Sunday night, in the Talmud Sota, we learned about how do we deal with a suspected adulteress. If your husband has a wife that he told him not to be with this man, he doesn't trust what's going on between his wife and this other guy, and he tells his wife, do not even be secluded where no one could see you together with that guy. And the woman doesn't listen, and she does it anyway. And now there's a suspicion that something took place. In the old days, didn't have video cameras or GPS or tracking or anything else. How would they know if something happened or not? They didn't even have DNA tests or whatever. So they had a very magical potion. We learned in our Sunday night class. Hashem made this thing that they would erase God's name inside the water, and they would give it to the woman to drink. And they would go over to the copper basin, Rashi tells us here, take out the water from this copper basin that they're using for the Kohanim to wash their hands and their feet. And the woman would drink that, and that would prove her innocence. In other words, so the husband wouldn't want to have anything to do with his wife anymore because he suspected that something took place. But by giving this potion, that would prove that nothing happened and that the husband should not be angry at his wife, or they could get back together and create peace between husband and wife. So what you're having here is a beautiful story. The mirrors that the original amazing women used to create Am Yisrael, to lure their husbands to have children with them, okay, that those mirrors that we use for these things are going to go to create the item that the water that we'll drink from to prove that the woman really was faithful and did not do anything wrong, and that will create peace between husbands and the wife. That's a very beautiful Rashi on this section. But yes, let's go on verse 9. But yes, finally, the last item going on to the construction of the courtyard. They made the courtyard, the Fasnegav Teimana, from the south side, which is the length side of this massive courtyard. Kali Achatzer, they made the curtains out of twisted fine linen. Sheish Mashzar, twisted fine linen. Meya Ba'ama was 100 amas. It was massive courtyard. It was 150 feet. Imagine a huge yard, 150 feet long was the courtyard. That inside that courtyard sat the Mishkan, the tabernacle, and the altar inside there. Amudei Mesrim, and how many poles, beams did you need to hold up this huge 150-foot curtain? Amudei Esrim, you needed 20 poles. Vadnei Esrim, and under those poles were 20 sockets. That so as we always learn, how do they set up something? Because you're not digging into the ground and sticking the pole in the ground. It sat on sockets. These poles, these pinewood poles, these pillars sat on sockets. So there was 20 pillars going along the 150-foot long wall fence that made out of twined linen. And they had 20 sockets, or socket under each of those poles. Nachashas, what were the sockets made out of? Out of copper. So if you remember, on the sockets that the actual Mishkan, the tabernacle building, stood on, those were silver. Sockets over here for the fence, for the surrounding the entire courtyard, those were copper. But the little hooks that were on top of the poles that the curtains hooked onto, those were silver, and they had this nice band, like a silver band, going around on the top of the beams of wood that held up the curtain. So again, they had a copper bottom base with a wood pole. Top of the wood pole was a silver hook and a silver, nice, fancy band on top, and they hung the curtains on those hooks. So that was on the south side, and the same thing was to the north side. We'll pass Tzafin into the north side. Me'ah ba'ama, for 100 amma, 150 feet was the opposite side. Amudeim on the north side. Amudeim Esrim is 20 poles. Vadneim Esrim and 20 sockets. The chayshes made out of copper. Vavi Amud b'choshkem kasef, but silver was the band on top, at the hook on top of those poles. Fas Yam. What about the western side, the more shorter side of the courtyard? Those were chamisha ba'ama. Those were 50 cubits, meaning 75 feet. So it was 150 feet by 75 feet. Amudeim Asara. Those you only needed half the amount of poles, because it's only half the size. So they had 10 poles. Vadnei Masara, with 10 bases. Vavi Amudim Choshgem Kasef, and the hooks and the silver and the bands, the fancy design bands on top of those poles were made out of silver. Lupas Kedma. Now, what about the front door? You couldn't have a curtain running across the whole way, according to the eastern side. Mizraka Chamishim Amma. Well, the eastern side of Mizrach, Kedma Mizracha, the eastern side was 50 amos, but the curtain only went part of the way. Kalayim Chamesh Esrei, the curtain was hanging 15. They made a hanging for 15 amma, 15 cubits, not 50, 15. Al Katif Amudeyam on the poles. They stand on the poles, shleisha, 3 poles, only 3 poles to hold the 15 cubits of curtain in the front by the door. The name of shleisha with their base being 3. So on one side they had 15, and also the other side they had 15. So they took up of the 50-foot opening. They wanted to narrow the door space, so they had 15 in each side, which made a total of 30, leaving a 20-foot door entrance left. The second side, they had a curtain hanging of 15 amas, 15 cubits. Under each of those 15-foot curtain hanging by the front entrance had 3 poles holding it up. And everything that was hanging around was made out of fine twisted linen. Everything was some of it was made out of, we learned, depending on the item, depending on if it was crochet or it was a different way it was made. This was twisted linen, is what they made this huge 150 foot by 150 foot by 50, 150 foot by 50 foot courtyard, is what they made with this fine twisted linen. And all the bases, all the poles, the wooden poles sat on sockets that were made out of copper. But always the hooks and the bands on top were made out of silver. And the overlay on their tops was silver. And now he tells you, and all the pillars, and they were banded with silver, all the pillars of the courtyard, that the whole courtyard had a band of silver design going on them. Masach Shara Chatzar, and this, but what about the door? So we said the front entranceway had, which was 50 feet. The opening of the entrance was 50 feet. You had 15 and 15, which is 30 of the amas of the cubits had a curtain in, but then you had a 20-foot opening, 20 cubit opening, which is maybe more like 30 feet. So Masach Shara Chatzar, they had also a screen in front that shouldn't be just wide open. A screen a few feet forward was a screen. A Masi Roikem, which was the work of an embroiderer. They made like a nice embroidery work. Tcheles Vargaman, that was a fancy screen doorway, curtain covering the front doorway. Tcheles Vargaman, so the shani was a mixture of different threads of 3-color wools, blue, purple, and crimson. B'sheish Masar and fine twist linen. Eser Ma'ama, and it was of course the 20-foot curtain front door hanging in the front to cover the opening space. With and its height in the width with 5 cubits corresponding to the hangings of the courtyard. Okay, so it was like the dimensions of the hanging of the courtyard. The doorway is just a few feet forward, just to cover, so not everybody walked by would see inside the courtyard. They built it a few feet in front of the door, covered it up, and I guess people would get in through the sides, be able to make their way into the entrance. And their beams holding up that front doorway curtain was 4. And had 4 bases. Nechoshes made out of copper. Vavi kesef, itzipui rashem, choshukem kesef. But again, as we keep on saying, the hooks on top of the poles with their nice design, some kind of a overlay on the top, all of it was silver. And they also needed pegs. Why do they need pegs? Because if you're hanging curtains on these poles, you also need like pegs to hold the curtain from flying back and forth to keep everything in place. So they also had pegs that were made out of copper that they stuck into the ground. And that is the end of the parsha.